down and somebody throws a wrinkle in it.
Mm-hmm. So let's hope that this works. It says we're preparing to go live. All right, and it looks like we are. Looks like we are live. All right, hi, I am Billy Griffith. Welcome to our latest installment of Rev War Reveille, here with Emerging Revolutionary War. Tonight we have a very special guest. It's a privilege to welcome on our show Dr. Mark Edward Lender. Dr. Lender is Professor Emeritus of History at Kane University and an award-winning historian. He is the co-author of A Respectable Army and Fatal Sunday, not just saying this, but two of my favorite Revolutionary War books, as well as the author of Fort Ticonderoga, The Last Campaigns, which just recently released, and Cabal, The Plot Against General Washington, which is what we'll widely be discussing tonight. So Dr. Lender, thank you for being part of this.
Thanks for the invitation, Billy. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get into what we historians and history is known as the Conway Cabal, you do cover this topic briefly in your Monmouth book, Fatal Sunday, but what inspired you afterwards to kind of expand on the subject and write a book on it?
Research and scholarship leads to research and scholarship. You get into, again, you're an author yourself, so you know how this goes. You work on a project, you get deeply into it, and you notice enough material to say, hey, I want to go back and look at that again because it's not quite what I'm doing now, but it could be something on its own. Chapter 2 of Fatal Sunday deals with the criticisms that Washington faced, frankly, because of his military record in late 1777 and early 1778. This was a general who was having real problems in the field. You hire a general to win wars, or at least not to lose them. And in late 1777, of course, Washington had met serious reverses on the battlefield. Our point in Fatal Sunday was that the Monmouth campaign put all of that right. It was Monmouth that actually showed the public that Washington was a capable leader, that the disappointments of 1777 had been reversed, that the Continental Army was now an outfit that could be respectable in the field, as Washington called it, the respectable army. But what I did not go into in Fatal Sunday was the depth of the criticisms that Washington was facing, and to what extent were these people members of Congress, members of patriot political and opinion hierarchies across the colonies. How serious were they as they addressed Washington's shortcomings in the field? And was there really a faction or any number of folks who thought Washington either should be replaced or have its command authority curtailed? Perhaps even have him replaced by another senior officer. And the person we're talking about, of course, Bates, whose record in 1777 included the surrender of an entire British army. That's what intrigued me. So I went back to my material that I put together from Fatal Sunday and asked my sources, is there enough for another project? And the answer was yes. And there was a lot of material I had not tracked down. I was back to the archives, went back to both published and unpublished primary sources. And there was a remarkable amount there that bore directly on what has become known as the Conway Cabal. By the way, Conway Cabal was a 19th century. No one ever called it that, although they did use the word cabal in 1770s and 70s. That much is true. But no one called it the Conway Cabal in 1777.
Yeah, so I'm hoping tonight, for the people who this is the first time that they might be learning about this subject, that we can really dive into, as you said, like kind of the myths surrounding the cabal, like even just the naming of it. And also, was it real? Has it just been exaggerated since then? Were there actual threats to General Washington at this point in this conflict? And that kind of leads into my next question. looking back now in history, Washington is the marble man. He's the indispensable man. We couldn't think of, people actually standing up against Washington and trying to oust him from command of the army. But in 1777, they didn't have the benefit of hindsight like we did. Things are not really that great when it comes to Washington's wartime record so far, besides maybe the victories at Trenton, Second Trenton, and Princeton. Things are not looking great for the American army and the American cause. And this will be the second straight year that things are going to begin to grow bleak as the year comes to a close. So explain Washington's record so far in the war as it entered the fall, winter 1777, where we'll start to hear this whisper campaign begin.
This is the context that we need. But I'll ask everyone to keep in mind that when you talk about Washington's record in 1777, and I'll talk about that in a second, but bear in mind that the context has got to be 1777, not 2020 looking back. Now we know what happened, or we have a pretty good idea of what happened. In 1777, no one understood that eventually independence would be secured. The British would sue for there'd be a settlement, that Washington would be the commander who, at least on the battlefield, allowed all of that to come around. Nobody knew that. And bear in mind that when Congress hired its officers, not just Washington, but it commissioned major generals, it commissioned brigadiers, the states issued commissions to thousands of officers. They did this in order to win a war. And the context was, and we're talking about the extent to which the American colonists were aware of their own military history. And their military history was essentially a French and Indian War. And they knew that during the French and Indian War, Britain sent out commander-in-chief after commander-in-chief and fired them when they didn't win. And ultimately, they got Jeffrey Amherst, who ended up a war winner. It took a while to get Amherst, and it took a while before the British were secure in the fact that they had an officer who could win the war for them. Congress discussed this when they evaluated Washington's performance. They knew darn well that William Pitt, as prime minister, had relieved officers who hadn't done the job. And their job was to hire a general who would win. I'm going to suggest, I'm not going to suggest flat out right, because you say it in the book Cabal, that Congress would not have been doing its job if they had not looked critically at what Washington was doing in 1777. It was their job to evaluate the man they hired and hold him accountable. So, having said that, on to the answer. That's a long way to say, okay, now I'll answer your question. But what Washington came up against was, it's kind of interesting, and I make this point as strongly as I can in the book. In early 1777, and during the so-called Forage Campaign in New Jersey, Washington had rebuilt that army in Morristown. And in the spring of 1777, the Continentals, in conjunction with New Jersey militia, came out fighting. Drove the British nuts. William Howe tried desperately to draw Washington into a showdown fight in New Jersey, couldn't get it. And that's what led to the Philadelphia campaign, as Howe withdrew from New Jersey and then went all the way around, came up head of Elk in Maryland, up to Chesapeake, marched overland. The Continentals' performance in New Jersey in early 1777 was such that there were members of Congress who would, some of whom would become Washington's critics, honestly believed that the war was going to end in 1777, that the British didn't stand a chance against this new Continental Army. So expectations in the fall of 1777, as the British are advancing from head of Elk in what became the Philadelphia campaign, expectations were very high that Washington was going to win this war in the field. And of course, he loses at Brandywine. It's a little beyond our ken this evening to go into the details of the Battle of Brandywine, but Washington got outflanked. The army did not do badly. They fought well. They had to drop back. Ultimately, they lost Philadelphia, which was a staggering blow to Patriot morale. In October, Washington attempts to counterattack at Germantown. And after a good start, confusion sets in, counterattack fails. The real crusher came in November. Through the end of November, there was considerable hope among a lot of rebels that the Americans could retake Philadelphia simply by holding the Delaware River forts. Fort Mifflin on the Pennsylvania side, on Red Bank, Fort Mercer on the New Jersey side. Traditionally, back then, we're talking the years before the climate changes we know it today, the Delaware generally froze over and it was closed to navigation. If Washington could hold those forts and keep the Delaware River closed until it froze over, William Howe would have had a very, very difficult time in this city. Maybe he may even have had to abandon it because the Royal Navy could not keep him supplied. They desperately needed the Delaware River open so that they could keep supplies. Those forts fell by the third week in November. And it was the fall of the Delaware River fort that brought Washington's critics out in full. Again, we look back, it's almost a good guys, bad guys. It wasn't. I mean, the bad guys being Washington's critics, the good guys being those who rallied to Washington's. It wasn't that way. The people who criticized Washington were patriots. They wanted to win the war as badly as anybody else. James Lovell, fire-eating delegate from Massachusetts, stringent Washington, could not believe that those forts had been lost, that the British were not going to be driven from Philadelphia. He blamed it on Washington. While he's doing that, his son is a Continental officer in Washington's army. Lovell didn't want to lose that war. He wanted a general to win it. I can point to others. Abraham Clark, New Jersey, a critic of Washington's strategy, delegate. His sons were prisoners of war on these terrible prison hulks in New York Harbor. And Samuel Adams, a zealot, if ever there was one, his son is serving in the Continental Army as an Army doctor. Close to the lines, literally risking his life. These men did not have a personal animus against Washington. What they wanted was someone who could win in the field. They weren't getting it in George Washington. They simply were not getting it. And that is, and as I mentioned earlier, if no one had questioned, arguably, they would not have been doing their job. I mean, today, we would not tolerate a general who was hired as commander-in-chief who wasn't winning. Simply wouldn't be tolerated. But we got to get rid of this good guys, bad guys. About there was. Go ahead.
Oh no, and I was going to say, you really hit home the point of how Washington was not doing his job, what was being asked of him at this time. Further north, however, there was a general there who was, in the eyes of Congress, doing his job. And who was that?
Yeah, Washington had the misfortune of hitting, shall we say, his at a time when another American general, to whom historians have not been kind, was doing rather well. And we're talking about Major General Horatio Gates. Was a British veteran who had come to America after going about as far as he could go in the. He sold up his commission. Actually, he sold his commission to a very gallant British grenadier who would get killed at Monmouth. Henry Colonel Monckton. But Gates, early in the war, worked cordially with Washington. He was the adjutant general. This was the paper pusher, if you will, of the Continental Army. He had administrative skills as a British veteran that the Continentals desperately needed. He knew how to move the paper around. He knew how to handle supply requisitions. He knew how to keep records. He knew how to make sure that people got paid. He knew how to draft orders so that people understood what they meant. This was desperately needed by this new American army, and Washington deeply appreciated what Gates was doing. Gates also did a pretty good job in the field as the American disaster in Canada unfolded, and the army retreated back through New York State, and ultimately stabilizing at Ticonderoga. Gates was the right man, the right place. He stabilized the army. He corresponded closely with Washington and other officers in getting supplies up Ticonderoga, reorganizing the army as it retreated from Canada. He deserves a lot of credit for restoring the Northern Front, at least around the Fort Ticonderoga region. So this is a man who had a record. And I'm not going to get into who deserves what kind of credit for winning the Battle of Saratoga. Gates, no, it was Arnold, no, it was Schuyler, it was all three. And that's a can of worms that will probably never be closed. The fact is that Gates was the man on the scene and did force the surrender of John Burgoyne's army in October of 1777, and was genuinely acclaimed an American national hero. Again, we've got to use the context of 1777, not the context of 2020. Gates would ultimately face a lot of criticism, historical criticism, because of his antagonistic relationship with Washington. And of course, he lost an American army in 1780 at the Battle of Monmouth in South Carolina. Never recovered. But in 1777, this was the man on the white horse. He had defeated a British army. He had brought credit to American arms. It was Saratoga, which, at least in part, convinced the French that the Americans were not going to drop out of the war, that they were worth backing. Had a lot to do with the forging of the successful Franco-American alliance. So when Gates was called to Philadelphia to head the Board of War, we'll talk about war. He didn't come to Philadelphia. He went to York. Congress was exiled to York, about 100 miles due west. He was hosannas in the streets. People applauded. People were desperately glad to see him. You had politicians who thought, finally, here's the guy who's going to straighten out our war effort. You had officers who believed, here's the man who's going to straighten out our war effort. And Horatio Gates did not lack for self-esteem, let's put it that way. He thought he was the guy who was going to straighten out the war effort. He was, after Saratoga, he was a bit full of himself. There's no question about it. And nevertheless, his reputation was deserved at the time. He would lose it later, but at the time, we have to give him credit for being a man on the spot, and people had faith in him. They really did. Not Washington, but an awful lot of other folks did.
So, following the losses at Brandywine and the capture of Philadelphia, you had mentioned that members of Congress do begin to lose faith in George Washington and maybe see that Gates is actually the better option. What about within Washington's own officer corps? It's well known that Washington had, men who were very faithful, very loyal to him throughout, the good and the bad. But at this time, when things are looking dark, does confidence in him within his own officers corps begin to waver?
Yeah. One of the interesting things I found was we know, and on the historical record, there are a number of letters that are quite well known. Letters from officers talking about Washington in very derogatory fashion. One, perhaps the most famous, is by a Major General Thomas Conway, who wrote to Horatio Gates in the aftermath of the Saratoga victory. Conway had been in the Philadelphia campaign under Washington. Wrote a letter that it was a private letter, but through very odd circumstances that are almost right out of a novel, became public. I mean, a truly bizarre situation, became public, or at least excerpts of it became public. Highly critical of Washington, and Washington found out about it. please. What I found was that if you started to look in different archives, lots of people were writing to Horatio Gates. And they were all not necessarily derogatory in their treatment of Washington, but certainly laudatory in their treatment of Horatio Gates. And you had some very, very interesting people writing to him. And, one was Thomas Mifflin. Thomas Mifflin, Major General, Division Commander, also Army Quartermaster General, who had fallen out with Washington. They had been very close at the beginning of the war, but for all kinds of personal reasons we don't have time to go into today, their relationship had cooled, and Washington was also critical, and justifiably so, of Mifflin's performance as Quartermaster General. I mean, the Army was beginning to, logistics operations were beginning to collapse. Let's put it that way. It was constant combat, the grinding trial of defeat after defeat. The logistics effort just couldn't, and Mifflin was not the man to really drive it. But he became critical of Washington and very, very close to Horatio Gates. And he wrote a letter that did not become public. In November of 1777. This is after Horatio Gates had won the Battle of Saratoga. Mifflin wrote him a letter that, had it become public, would have been bombshell. And in it, he said, "You've got to come south. I mean, you, Horatio Gates, have got to come south to the Philadelphia area and put things right, because the man in charge right now has blown it." He didn't say blown it, but we would. It was the modern, the 1770s equivalent. Highly critical that Congress had to call Gates down. That would have just been a lot. The circle around Mifflin knew it, but I found a total of 16 letters from different officers back and forth to one another. Most of them actually sent to Horatio Gates with the same tenor. Anthony Wayne wrote one of them. And Anthony Wayne, of course, became a trusted lieutenant of George Washington. But at the time, they just told Gates, "We're losing battles." And given Anthony Wayne's temperament, and he was a fighter, and he just couldn't stand losing in combat. And it appeared that Gates was the guy who was not going to lose. So you had generals writing to Horatio Gates. You had lower-ranking officers. You had lower-ranking officers writing back and forth to each other, saying, "We don't know what we're going to do, but it looks like Gates can win, and we don't know if the guy in charge down here can pull it off." You had a crisis of faith in the commander-in-chief. Let's put it that way, and it was quite genuine. And again, I asked, what do you expect? I mean, if Washington is not managing to win, what are soldiers supposed to do? They don't want to lose. They need some reassurance. Morale has got to be made. What do we? So this really sets up the context for a movement that became known as the Conway Cabal. Poor Thomas Conway. I mean, that letter that leaked from him to Horatio Gates in the 19th century, the Conway Cabal, his name was tagged on. Would have been stunned to realize. But became known as the Conway Cabal, grew out of this malaise, this crisis of confidence in Washington. And again, we should not be surprised. The next question is going to be, what form did it take?
Yeah. So you made these key personalities that are going to be kind of at the epicenter of the so-called cabal. You had Thomas Mifflin, Conway, as well as Horatio Gates. Now, both Mifflin and Gates are going to be added to what is called the Board of War, which is essentially going to be a very formal and legitimate Um,
Sure.
you could say that's can you usurp Washington's power
Sure.
and his overall vision. So explain what the actual Board of War was, what was its duties, and what did Mifflin and Gates really have to do with it?
The Board of War was established in 1776. Congress realized that as acting as a committee of the whole, it couldn't run the war. It had Indian affairs, it had the political affairs with 13 different state governments, it had an economic situation that was impossible. It had diplomacy to conduct. All of it, I mean, its attention was scattered in any number of different directions. So what Congress did was said, we're going to create a board, 5 members, and we're going to take the members of Congress who probably know most about how to run a war effort and put them in charge. And their job will be to do routine military correspondence so Washington doesn't. They will store equipment that isn't being used so Washington doesn't have to. They'll take care of prisoners of war so Washington doesn't. They'll deal with routine military um, record keeping so Washington doesn't have to. The whole idea was to take some of the administrative burden off of Washington's shoulders, leaving him free to act in the field. It was never the intention of the Board of War. It was never intended to get involved in the day-to-day operations of the Army. It was never intended to get involved in operational questions of actually, military action running the war. The problem with the Board of War was it was made up of members of Congress. So you had the same problem. John Adams was the president of the first war, and he looked back later on and said, I never had a more difficult time when I was president of the Board of War, because he was doing everything else. I mean, you think of all the things that John Adams was involved with. Well, all the other members of the Board of War were involved with these different things too. So you took small number of members of Congress and you threw on them everything that Congress as a whole had been dealing with earlier. It didn't work. So in 1777, the Board of War was reorganized, not to include members of Congress, professionals, people who had military experience, who had administrative experience, and they would take over the functions of the Board of War. Again, it was to do these mundane record keeping, correspondence, equipment inventories, that kind of thing. Never intended to get involved with daily operations. Never intended to get involved with strategic questions or operations. But the inevitable but. Thomas Mifflin had a great deal of influence in Congress, and that's for reasons beyond our ken here as well. But he was an influential individual, and he was a capable individual. Congress followed his advice in reorganizing the Board of War, and of course, they named Mifflin to the Board of War. And it was at Mifflin's suggestion that Congress invited Horatio Gates to be the president of the Board of War. He could still wear his uniform. If he wanted to, he could still take the field. Now, as president of the Board of War, guess who reports to him? Washington. Horatio Gates becomes Washington's civilian superior. The Army reports to the Board of War. Now you've got Gates, who is no friend of Washington. You have got Thomas Mifflin, who is no friend of Washington. You've got the rest of the Board of War is still forming right now. So Gates and Mifflin have inordinate influence. You would eventually have Timothy Pickering on the Board of War, whose relationship Washington, another former adjutant general, whose relationship with Washington was problematic. In essence, what you've got is a Board of War that is not all right with the commander-in-chief on a personal basis. Things go wrong very, very quickly. There's a term that sort of explains itself: mission creep. That is when an organization established to do X looks around and said, okay, I can do X, but I can do Y as well. Sometimes that is not a bad thing. But if Y is really out of the area for which the organization ended, it becomes a power. And what we had in early 1778 was a power grab on the part of the board. Let's give you an example. We'll go back to Thomas. Conway was a very, very capable brigadier general. He was a Frenchman. He was Irish born, but he grew up in France. His parents moved to France when he was 4 or 5 years old. He was bilingual. And a lot of the French officers who came over to join the Continental Army were not, but you didn't speak English. Conway spoke very, very good English. And of course, French, native language. He came over, he said, I'm coming over here to burnish my resume. I want to go back to France and get promoted. Congress impressed with him. John Adams was impressed with him. Washington liked him at the beginning. He was a competent brigade commander. But he really, really thought he was smarter than every other American brigadier. And he let people know it. And he shamelessly importuned Congress for promotion to a major general. He was the junior brigadier general. And you can imagine what the reaction of all the other brigadiers was. They hated this guy. Washington was just of him. What do I do with him? He won't shut up. He's constantly trying to become a major general. My other generals are quite threatening to resign en masse if this guy gets promoted. Conway had made friends with Horatio Gates, and he'd made friends with Thomas. Now comes an episode that just shook the Army. Washington wanted an inspector general. The inspector general would come up with a uniform training regimen, a uniform drill regimen. This is what Steuben actually did in the long run. But the Board of War under Thomas agreed we need an inspector general. Washington wanted that man as a member of his own staff, a key officer, according to him. That's not what happened. The Board of War persuaded Congress to pass legislation saying that the inspector general would not report to Washington, report to the Board of War. So it would be the Board of War that would determine what the uniform drill and training program of the Army was going to be. The Board of War that would be responsible for evaluating the performance of officers. Now, this, Washington is losing an amazing chunk of his command authority. An officer who should have been one of his key staff members is not going to be his. And Mifflin has the board appoint, promoting him to major general, making him inspector general of the Army. Now, we've always been very, very proud of the fact that Washington insisted on military subordination to civilian authority. The civilian authority in this case was Congress and the Board of War. Washington simply stonewalled. Conway shows up at Valley Forge. Washington is barely civil. The rest of the officers barely wouldn't even speak to the guy. Conway eventually leaves in a huff and goes back to complain to Congress and the Board of War. Congress reacts like a bunch of deer caught in the headlights. They don't know what to do. They simply have an inspector general who the Army refuses to deal with. Is this insubordination on Washington's part? I don't know. He simply refused to deal with a man that was appointed by Congress. Is that insubordination? I'll leave that up to you and the audience. It certainly wasn't going along with civilian authority. Nevertheless, it ultimately came right because in February of 1777, Steuben shows up, eventually gets confirmed in the job. But Conway is still around to be a thorn in Washington's side in other ways. But so how you have the first major confrontation between this new Board of War trying to insert itself into the vital operations of the Army. Then Horatio Gates decides to take the initiative in supply operations. And he ignores the existing commissary department of the Army that reports to Washington. And he has Congress pass legislation saying that there's going to be a new commissary operation parallel to the commissary department run by the Board of War, reporting directly to Gates. He doesn't call them purchasing officers, he calls them superintendents, but they're going to go out and compete for the same supplies the existing commissary department is competing for. The Army is in Pennsylvania at the time, Valley Forge. Pennsylvania government, trying to help out, puts its purchasing people. So you've got three different commissary operations competing for the same supply. This was just, I almost said a terrible thing, but a real mess, let's put it that way, beginning with cluster. It was it was awful. And again, this is a blow to Washington's authority. Washington wanted his commissary general fired and replaced, but he wanted that commissary department to him. Mifflin comes back on, calls for a complete reorganization of the quartermaster general's operation. Again, taking the authority of the quartermaster general away from Washington. It was, forget the details right now. The key thing is, here with the inspector generalship, the commissary operations of Gates, quartermaster plans of Mifflin, you're eviscerating the command authority of the commander-in-chief. Gates begins to operate directly. He creates artillery units, which specifically are not to come under the command of Washington's chief of artillery, Brigadier Henry Knox. Knox writing letters to Washington. What's Gates up to? Why is he doing this? Then in February of 1777, the final straw, the Board of War decides to invade. How the Board of War is going to do that, the Army barely hanging in, barely existing in February at Valley Forge. Where's the money going to come from? Where's the supplies going to come from? Where are the troops going to come? And where's Washington? Gates makes this decision without consulting Washington. He also says and issues direct orders to this young fellow, Lafayette. You're going to go north. You speak French. The French Canadians will love you. You take command of this whole thing. Lafayette says, I work for George Washington. He then says, I'm not going to have anything to do with this unless I can come to York, talk directly to the Board of War. Now, this is breaking orders. He has received direct orders from Horatio Gates. Washington has been informed after the fact. Lafayette goes to Washington. What do? Washington allows, knowing that the Board of War has issued direct orders. Lafayette. Washington allows Lafayette to go and object personally in York. Again, Washington is at loggerheads with the civilian commanders. In the end, the invasion, the eruption into Canada, as the Board of War was calling it, was absurd. And this finally brings an end to the cabal. Now, the cabal really, if you look back at it, was not some clandestine conspiracy. It didn't have to be. The Board of War operated legally. It operated in the open. You don't have to conspire if you have the legal authority to act. And they had the legal authority to act. Every step they took along the way had congressional approval. And it was only after this insane plan, this eruption into Canada, when Congress finally drew back and said, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? And there are some wonderful correspondence by, one of the best is by Joseph Reed, who was early in the war and aide to Washington, who had a cool relationship with Washington by 7. They had also fallen out. But Reed was a member of Congress. And he finally said, wait a minute. How do we entrust so much command authority to a man and then pass measures to bind his hands? Either time to unbind those hands or change them. In other words, it's time to back Washington or get rid of him. And he said, we can't, it would just too disruptive. We've got to back. So that really wrapped. By the end of February, Washington had organized himself politically, and Washington was working. He was working in political overdrive to counter what was going on with the Board of War. I think this whole episode was one of the things that really separated Washington from just being a mere general. It made him a commander-in-chief. And there's a difference between a general and a commander-in-chief. Has got to be aware of political realities. He's got to be able to deal with disparate personalities, difficult politicians, to be able to bring people together in a unified way behind a common effort. This forced him to do that. And I think he emerged, frankly, he was a better politician than anybody.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Yeah, Washington, really at this stage, he knows what's going on behind his back, even all the whispering and everything. This war of whispers that's being waged. It's not that quiet. Stuff's getting back to him. He knows that people are losing faith in him, but he's also, going just business as usual and kind of keeping his head down and moving forward, almost appearing as like the sympathetic subject in all of this. Like he was the better and the stronger man too to bite his tongue. So going forward though, how did George Washington politically navigate the Board of War? Did the Board of War really back off after this and give him his authority back, or did he have to learn to be the politician to work with them?
What Washington, I loved it. The documentation is there, just people had not really organized it to see how effectively Washington had done this. But here's what he did. By February of 1777, the situation with the army at Valley Forge become dire. I mean, this is on the record and nothing new. But finally, you had a number of members of Congress, notably Henry Lawrence, who was president of Congress at the time, and the father of Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence, who was a very close member of Washington's inner circle. He was an aide, very good friend of Alexander Hamilton, part of what Washington referred to as his military family. So Henry Lawrence was in direct communication through the whole time with John Lawrence. John Lawrence kept his father informed of what was going on in the army, and Henry Lawrence through John Lawrence, and direct communication with Washington, kept the army informed of what was going on in Congress. Things got so bad that at the urging of Lawrence and a few others, Congress formed what it called the Committee at Camp. And this was going to be a small core of individuals, between 5 and 7 members, depending upon who was going to be available. They would leave York. The committee would actually go to camp at Valley Forge and get firsthand experience. I mean, in New York, a lot of members of Congress simply couldn't understand what was going on at Valley Forge. That things were really that bad? My gosh. So they sent this committee out there. There's an old political adage that whoever sets the agenda wins. And Washington knew this. And he knew the committee at camp was coming to Valley. And he got ready for it. He sat down with Alexander Hamilton, and no doubt with others as well, but Hamilton, who drafted this, working closely with Washington. And by the time that committee got, they had a draft agenda for what Washington wanted done. And Washington wasn't taking any chances that Congress was going to come out with its own agenda. He made darn sure that the minute Congress got there, they were presented with everything Washington thought the army needed, and with the mechanisms Washington thought. It was all laid out. It's a brilliant document. And that set the agenda for the committee. It was Washington's agenda. And he played it brilliant. As a politician, he was never better. And, people marvel at what Washington's. I mean, the volumes upon volumes of published papers, and Lord only knows how many papers lost to us over time. But Washington knew what he was doing. Get it all on paper. Get it to the people who you're going to have to deal with. and make sure they're dealing with what you want to deal with, not with what. And the committee at camp dealt one by one with problems Washington wanted them to deal with. And politically, it was, I don't know how he could have played it better. Again, this goes back to the difference between a commander-in-chief and a he played the political hand. He didn't play poker, but I'll bet he would have been a great poker. He really knew how to play his cards. He really did.
So coming out of the winter of 1777, 1778, the American army pursues Henry Clinton's British army across New Jersey, ultimately resulting in the American victory at the Battle of Monmouth. And I think you said earlier in the talk that surviving that winter for his army and Washington himself as commander, and then gaining that victory, that's really what cemented Washington as, you could say, the indispensable man, the untouchable.
I agree. And I know you've written on this as well, Billy, and I think we see it in much the same fashion. Washington needed more than just a drawn battle. And one can argue over the tactical result versus the strategic result. And tactically, it was a draw. Washington did very, very well. Clinton also did well. He got away. But strategically, Washington had essentially reversed the fortunes of 1777, firmed up, again, more evidence to the French that the Americans could win this. And there was a spin campaign. Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, others chipped in to play it up in public opinion as a resounding American victory. So, and look, to the extent that people thought it was a resounding victory for Washington, it was. That's what
morally, it definitely was.
What mattered. And that's the impression that the battle left him. And that's what allowed Washington to really put paid critics of 1777 and earlier in 1770. Look, you had your shot at me. I rebuilt this army at Valley Forge. We came out stronger than when we went in. We went up against the cream of the British army, and look at the result. We have a continental army that can fight. The British have left. So this really took the wind out of Horatio Gates' sail. Congress sort of invited him to leave and go take a field, and which was sort of a secondary command. Gates knew it. The Board of War was reorganized, came under the direction of individuals who were favorable to Washington. Washington never had any problems with the Board. So Monmouth allowed him to wrap it up in a way that really put him beyond serious criticism for the rest of the war.
Yeah,
I think you've reached the same conclusion in your research. I hope.
Yeah, definitely. Now we talked a little bit about we know what the fate of Washington is, what the fate of Gates is. What about the fates of Conway and Mifflin? What happens to them after this?
Well, let's look at let's look at Conway first. Conway was not involved in the Monmouth campaign. He was back in reoccupied Philadelphia. As soon as the fighting stopped at Monmouth, literally within days, two individuals, Brigadier General Cadwalader, Pennsylvania militia, and Major General Dickinson of the New Jersey militia. These were cousins of Washington, fire-eating Washington allies. I mean, they were just wrote back. Washington marching east with the army toward the Highlands in New York. They would take up positions. These guys are going west back to Philadelphia. Cadwalader challenges Conway to, and this is obviously settling. That's what it was. They fight the duel. Conway is wounded, hit near the mouth, which Cadwalader was really happy. At least I didn't kill him, but I at least had his mouth. And the accepted version is that as he recovered, Conway wrote to Washington saying, "I'm sorry, I meant no offense," blah, blah, blah. And then he went back to France. He did well in France. He got promoted and ended up going to French India, became governor briefly of French India, came back to France in time for the revolution, and his political instincts were as good in France as they were in America. Again, he picked the wrong side, he backed the wrong horse, and he had to flee for his life. Died in pretty much obscurity, I think, in Great Britain. And I think the British actually helped him get away. Now, there's irony. Actually helped him get away. So he had his moment of glory back in France, but the French Revolution. Thomas Mifflin was a survivor. He was not a radical. He was more a political moderate, to even in many respects conservative than some of the Pennsylvania politicians. But he ends up as an important political figure in Pennsylvania. And 1783, he ends up president of the Continental Congress. And it's meeting in Annapolis. And here is irony for you again. When Washington dramatically surrenders his commission, he surrenders it to Thomas Mifflin as president of Congress. King Mifflin wishes, where was this 5 years ago? But of all people, for Washington to give up his commission, it was Thomas Mifflin who was president of the Congress. Mifflin goes on to an active political career in Pennsylvania. When he died, he was a member of either the Pennsylvania Senate or the Assembly. I forgot. He was an elected member of Pennsylvania. The day he died, and the guy was a survivor. Give him credit for that.
So to kind of wrap things up, I got a few more questions for you. While tackling this subject and writing this book, what were some of the biggest obstacles that you faced while writing Cabal? Was it trying to just totally dispel,
You're talking about this book. I was just for Shameless Commerce, which, like rolls of Scotch tape, there should be several in every room, right? The biggest challenge in writing it, first of all, I just do want to say I really enjoyed the project. I did not know that there would be so much material out there. The archives were relatively convenient. I was blessed with a fellowship at the Smith Library at Mount Vernon. So I had a full month to do nothing, focus on it. So Mount Vernon is also, their collections are terrific. It's also very close to the Library of Congress, so I was able to use manuscript there. There's an entire collection in the Library of Congress of Washington's papers of Washington's staff members, and just a mother load of stuff. Horatio Gates papers and stuff in both the New York Historical Society and the New York Library, the American Philosophical Society, plenty of revolutionary papers. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania has papers of revolutionary authors, including a very rich collection. So, you know the feeling, Billy. You get into a manuscript collection and you're actually reading and working from the stuff that you're studying actually left. The Virginia Historical Society, tons of stuff, wonderful material, and I love it, to tell you the truth. I mean, to actually get into these archives, and particularly when you start finding the stuff that you're looking for. Again, I had no idea that sources would be as rich as they were, and I was very lucky. Also, lucky with the internet. The papers of George Washington are the online edition is it's a remarkable achievement. And, it's so easy to use. You have to go to the sources to track down those Washington papers.
Can't even imagine what I was researching before the internet. It was like.
But I would say of various things I've done, this is one of the most enjoyable projects I've undertaken.
Now, once you completed it, did you find yourself more sympathetic towards someone like Thomas Conway or Mifflin, or were you still like kind of indifferent?
It's not necessarily a matter of being sympathetic to one side or the other. I think it's just just an appreciation of where everybody was coming from.
Mhm.
As I said, uh, it just doesn't make sense to see this as good guys versus bad guys. You had individuals who differed on how to fight that war and even in what the war was all about. And that's the nature of it was a revolution, let's face it. And in a revolution, not everybody agrees on on all objectives. People go to war for different reasons. And even as you're fighting that same war, those reasons are still out there. And I'll just give one quick example. Some of the real radical critics, James Lovell, John Adams, Samuel Adams, didn't believe that we would win the war with a regular army. Now, Washington wanted a regular professional army. Others said, no, we need a militia. We can't fight European regulars as regulars. We need to chip away at them in what we would call a guerrilla war using our militia. And look what the militia did at Lexington and Concord. They did outside of Boston. The militia did at Saratoga. They had a case. And they disagreed with Washington's preference for a regular continental army. And there was back and forth on that. That also led to the antagonism between Washington and Congress. But they all wanted to win that war. It was just a matter of maintaining what unity you could as people argued over how to win.
So to finish it off now, I got one last question, kind of tie into emerging Revolutionary Wars bus tour we're going to be doing later this year. I figure since have you on, have to ask this kind of question. Fatal Sunday, if you have not read it, it is by far the definitive study, not just the Monmouth campaign, but all the politics as well involved in it, like we've been discussing tonight. Do you have a favorite story from the actual Battle of Monmouth or something specifically tied to the battle that interests you the most?
You know, what I did really come to appreciate was the private reactions of the individuals on both sides to look at Anthony Wayne, for example. His reaction to the following day saying, my God, we not only beat these, he's writing to a friend back in Philadelphia, tell all the Tory ladies who dated these British officers a few months ago what we did to these guys. And I mean, it was a thumb in the eye. And you gotta love that kind of thing. Then you go over to the British side and you look at officers who had just held the American soldiery in disdain earlier, saying, holy cow, look at these guys today. These guys can fight. And one of them, General Erskine, we've never experienced such a flogging. These private reactions, I just found remarkable. Israel Shreve, the colonel of the 2nd New Jersey Regiment, writing to his wife Polly, gleefully on finding the body of a Tory that they had known before the war, describing, looks like he was lying down trying to take cover when a cannonball hit him in the shoulder, went right through him and came out the other side. He was overjoyed to his writing to his wife. It's just these visceral reactions of the people who were involved in all of this. And a lot of it quite tragic too. I mean, the American Army doctor going down the following day to a creek, a bog actually, where the British grenadiers had tried to get across and they were just caught in a crossfire of American artillery, finding a young British officer who just was obviously dying, and just the young man asking, just please, I don't want to just be lying down. Lean me up against a tree, so I can die sitting up. And that's all he could do, just to help us. Just the poignancy of a lot of it. That battle, and then I found 1845, two guys in New Brunswick, New Jersey, waiting for a canal boat. And they began to talk. Are you from the area? Yeah, from the area. I knew it. And as the conversation developed that both of them, they're old men by this point, had both been at the Battle of Monmouth. And as they talked further, they found that they were both in the same little incident and pulled each other out of trouble. Never saw each other again until that time in 1845. They put two and two together. Quite something.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, my favorite story. No, favorite stories plural. Bet, you bet.
Great, fantastic. Thank you.
Great experience.
And it's going to wrap things up tonight. So, Dr. Lender, I want to thank you again so much for being part of this and discussing the Conway Cabal with us. It really was a privilege to have you on. For our viewers, talked about the bus tour. If you haven't signed up for that yet, there's still tickets available for our November 2022 bus tour, Valley Forge and Monmouth. You can sign up on our website, as well as the links on our Facebook page. Our next ERW Revelry is going to be on August 21st. And that topic of discussion will be Nathaniel Green as Quartermaster General at Valley Forge. So I hope you can join us for that too. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday.